Hey everyone, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and today I have a question for you. 50 cals or 20mm cannons? During World War II, the US had a very special relationship with the 50 cal M2 Browning, and US armed forces continue to use the weapon even today. If there is a weapon that stood the test of time, it is the 50 cal M2 Browning.
Go ahead. Fire! A little higher. Come on, fire!
In its aviation variant, this weapon was used as both an offensive weapon on fighters like the P-51 Mustang and as a defensive weapon on bombers like this B-17 Flying Fortress. Both aircraft that you see here were filmed at the RAF Museum in London. Introduced in the 1920s, it started to be used on aircraft by the United States Army Air Corps, which later on became the Army Air Force, and they used it on basically every plane at that point, as did the United States Navy and the Marine Corps. And overall, the weapon really did rather well. There is, of course, the exception of some outliers like the P-38 Lightning that also used a 20mm Hispano cannon, but even that plane had 4 heavy machine guns under the hood, and overall, the 50 cal was the dominating aerial gun for US aircraft in World War II. And just to be clear, 50 cal of course translates into 12.7mm in metric. On the other hand, by and large, German Luftwaffe aircraft featured a split armament of initially light and then heavy machine guns from the MG-17 and then the MG-131, firing a 7.92mm and then a 30mm round respectively, mixed in with 1 or 2 or even more 20mm cannons depending on the plane type and variant. Of course, I'm only talking about the fighters here because the armament was slightly different on the bombers, but we're focusing on fighters. First, the 20mm cannon was the MGFF, based on an Oerlikon design. Then it became the MG-151-20, which was a different gun by Mauser. And of course, then also the Luftwaffe switched to the 30mm cannons, but I will come back to that later on. Now, every now and then I see this question pop up, people asking what was better, 50 cal or 20 mils? And there seem to be a lot of different takes on this, so today I want to weigh in on this topic. Let me make one thing clear from the start. I will not be saying that any of these weapons is better than the other, because first of all, I do not believe that this is possible. It's an apples and oranges situation. And quite frankly, I find it somewhat reductive and often more based on cherry picking, rather than looking at the context both the US and Germany found itself in during World War II, which did influence their respective decisions to go with the 50 cal or with a heavier cannon armament. Now, you might disagree on that, but hear me out first, and then I'll be more than happy to take a look at what your takes are down in the comment section. Both of these choices, in my opinion, the 50 cals in the hands of American pilots and aviators and the cannons in the hands of the Germans, make perfect sense for both of them given their operational and tactical context that they were used in. Now, there have been, both back in the day and also now, been attempts to compare these guns based on various properties, right? For example, power to weight ratio to know how much bang you're getting for your buck, or burst mass to know how much lead you're firing off in, let's say, a 1-second burst, or any sort of other hard data analysis. And that is one way of doing these comparisons, and I'll be drawing on some of that data here as well. In fact, there is a very good website and book that I'm drawing some information from, and this was written by Antony Williams and Dr. Emmanuel Gustin. They have multiple books on weapons and compare them as well, sometimes based on calculated data, but also with some extra context. And I'll draw on some of the data later on, but I won't be doing a mathematical comparison outright, except where I think that it is required. Because first of all, you can read it in their book and on their website, and also because I think that for the purposes of this video, looking at the context of use rather than the hard stats is a more organic way of explaining the topic of why these weapons were used, and not about how they stack up against each other. Let's look at the US first. When World War II started in Europe in 1939, the US was not yet involved, and it would not be involved for another 2 years, say. Pearl Harbor, that was in December 1941. During this time, and before this already, it was using 2 different weapons on their planes, mainly 2 different weapons. One was the 30 cal, that's 7.62 millimeters in metric, M2AN, based on the M1919 Browning, later on improved via the M1921 and further models as well. The other gun was the 50 cal M2AN, and yes, both guns were known as the M2, while the AN stands for Army and Navy, showing that it was used by both services. There were also some versions that were only used by the Army and only used by the Navy, but overall they actually standardized around the same gun. To keep things simple, in this video I will be referring to the two guns by their caliber only. The 30 cal was similar to the light machine guns many countries used at the time. Overall, it of course differed as a gun, but the caliber was roughly the same. As an aircraft gun, it was different to its ground-based cousin, however, having been lightened. But the 30 cal M2 Browning was never an, let's say, ideal gun for air combat. Yeah, it remained heavier than comparable guns, was more difficult to synchronize with the propeller without dropping the fire rate too much, and it was also prone to jamming. The US had started to introduce the 50 cal, however, in the 1920s. The 50 cal had, of course, a higher caliber, and when it started getting introduced, it was one of the heavier guns in aircraft available at the time, globally. And by that I mean both in caliber and in weight. Yeah, the 50 cal, even in its lightened aircraft version, was a heavy gun, but we'll see more of that later on as well. Now, when the 50 cal was introduced, we're in the 1920s here. Around this time, even a 50 caliber bullet was a very heavy bullet for an aircraft. For this, I need to make a little excursion to talk about aircraft designs. Yeah? We need to remember that before World War II, planes were generally lighter constructs and carried very little protection. The first attempts were made in World War I to add armor, but even a very small, insignificant plate, let's say of a width of 30 centimeters, that's about a foot, and maybe a length of 60 centimeters, that's about 2 feet, would be significantly impairing a plane operating on an engine running on 200, slightly more than 200 Jeremy Clarksons. But to a point, one might have assumed what was going to happen, because we see this increase in engine power even happening in World War I. In the beginning of World War I, we're operating on engines that are less than 100 horsepower, and later on we are beyond 200 horsepower by the end of the war. So you can see that perhaps with increasing capabilities in these engines, the aircraft will also be able to carry more weight. And that is correct to a point, except that on fighters, nothing really changes in terms of protection for about 20 years. Had World War I continued, maybe we would have seen a shift to armor and protection sooner, but it didn't. The shift to the monoplane, however, and an all-metal construction was a very recent one in the 1930s. It happened sort of in the mid-1930s. And it was not yet finished when World War I started in 1939. Many planes for a long time had been constructed via a wooden skeleton, especially in World War I, or a metal tubular construction. Yeah, I'm showing a few World War I aircraft here so you can really see what I'm getting at. This aircraft here has that wooden skeleton that I talked about and is only covered in fabric. Here is a German Albatros as a comparison. It doesn't have that fabric covering, but instead very thin wooden sheets to cover the fuselage. And then there were some aircraft in World War I that also had a metal tubular construction, a little bit similar to that wooden skeleton that you saw earlier. And aircraft that had this included the Fokker Eindecker, of course, which is quite a famous aircraft. And then, of course, also the Fokker D7, which you see here. I also have an Inside the Cockpit video on this aircraft and the Albatros, where I talk about them in more detail. So consider looking at those videos as well after this one. Other aircraft in World War I, like the German Roland, for example, were also already experimenting with light metal covers on the fuselage. But those cases were outliers. During the interwar period, the shift to metal coverings becomes more common. There have been improvements to construction and design, but it is still largely based on the same principles that we see in World War I. Even the Hawker Hurricane, in fact, of World War II had a composite construction of a metal-covered front section and a fabric-covered aft fuselage. And in fact, the first wings on this aircraft were also fabric-covered, but that quickly changed to metal-covered wings. Anyway, so in the 20 years following World War I, a lot of things changed, but a lot of things stayed the same as well. But it was only with the significant increase in engine performance in the later 1930s that really heavier firepower and also protection became an option for these aircraft. And we're really talking about the introduction of some of those really famous engines that you hear about in World War II, yeah? The Daimler-Benz 601, of course the Rolls-Royce Merlin as being another example. Still, by the time of the Spanish Civil War, so we're talking the late 1930s here, we are seeing that bombers, for example, are often still faster and outperform fighters, or that even if the fighters are able to outperform bombers, they lack the firepower to shoot those aircraft down because they are mainly limited to 2 machine guns. The increase in firepower and the increase in protection and the increase in performance in fighter planes happens in a very, very short period of time, really in the late, sort of the mid to late 1930s. And it really isn't complete until the very beginning of the 1940s. Anyway, going back to the Spanish Civil War, and this is not long before World War II, as I said. The Spanish Civil War only ended in 1938, yeah, a year before this. The phrase, "the bomber will always get through," was actually somewhat valid. And of course, there are new fighter models that get introduced in this time. Yeah, the Soviet Polikarpov I-16, perfect example. The British Hawker Hurricane, the Supermarine Spitfire, another example. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109. Again, those are aircraft here where you are seeing them starting to outperform bombers in terms of speed and performance. And they would also soon be able to carry the amount of guns they need to be a threat to these bombers. But that really happens around this period of time in the Spanish Civil War, really at the end of the Spanish Civil War. But before that, bombers and these larger aircraft that really don't look that fast were actually a lot faster than the fighters, which were mainly still biplanes. Now, even as fighter performance increases and firepower increases in all of these aircraft, fighters by and large, with very few exceptions, had no armor during this time, the late 1930s and even the beginning of 1940s. Armor really only starts to gain traction on fighters, yeah, in just about 1940, during the Battle of Britain, you might say. There are some cases where this already happened earlier, but overall, it's 1940s in the Battle of Britain, especially with German aircraft and British aircraft, this is when that happens. But to go back to the US here, armor on fighter aircraft was actually even relatively rare, or hasn't really been standardized yet by the time of the Battle of Midway, which was in June 1942. Of course, army planes, for example, like the P-39, did have armor. In fact, it had a bit too much armor, that one, and that's one of the reasons why this plane was very limited in operational terms in the South Pacific at this point in time. Something I will have a video on very shortly. In fact, if you're a Patreon or channel member, you probably already have access to it. Other planes like the P-40 also had some armor. But for the US Navy, for example, the F-4F Wildcat only got armor sent by the industry later on, and carrier crews around this time initially improvised by adding some rudimentary armor protection themselves for their pilots, even by early and mid-1942. For a lot of pilots, it also has to be said, it doesn't matter if they were American, if they were European, Soviet, Japanese, Italian, doesn't matter. Armor was disliked in the beginning. Yeah, it was felt that this made a plane more sluggish and unresponsive, and there is some truth to that. Yeah, a proper armor plate, let's say, of a certain thickness, usually this was between, in World War II, this was between, so at the low end 6 millimeters, usually about 8 millimeters, which is, I believe, a quarter to a third of an inch, to about 10 to 12 to 13 millimeters at the high end. At this point, we're about half an inch. It was heavy. Yeah, that stuff could weigh about 100 kilograms easily, about 200 pounds. Essentially the equivalent of a small bomb that were also carried around this time. Pilots considered agility and speed to be their primary defense, and that's not exactly wrong. But more and more pilots, especially during the Battle of Britain, we see this being introduced very slowly. First with sort of armored windscreens, then with an protective headrest, not covering the body yet, and then that full body plate behind the pilot seat covering the body. And that really is a process that sort of starts in May 1940, especially for the British. The Germans are slightly slower than that. They start rolling out the first protective measures in June. But it really takes 1940, the complete set of 1940, for that really to become standardized. But after that, it really is standardized and armor really gains traction. It is considered a thing that is necessary to protect the aircraft. Actually, not to protect the aircraft. On fighter planes, armor is only meant to protect the pilot, not the machine. And I always like to borrow a term from tabletop games here. Armor should not be considered as a means to guarantee protection. We should really consider it as more as a saving throw. Yeah? Everything has gone wrong and the pilot either has not noticed his enemy or was unable to shake him, and he gets another chance to live because of the armor. His machine, however, his aircraft, will probably get damaged or even shot down. Nowadays, with a lot of hindsight, of course, we often criticize the A6M0, that main Japanese Navy fighter aircraft. Japan had, of course, two air forces, the Army Air Service, which had completely different aircraft, to the Naval Air Service, or not every Japanese fighter was an A6M0, of course, but we often consider that aircraft to have no protection when it comes out in 1940, and that is true. The A6M0 does not have any protection measures when it comes out in 1940. But we also forget that this was nothing special at the time. What was special with the Zero is that for a long time it did not receive protective measures, as this became a standard thing in other aircraft, including other Japanese aircraft. Also, there are good reasons why the Zero never got any protection until the very end, but that is something for another video. Anyway, to continue the explanation of what's going on around this time. On bombers and on heavy aircraft, this was somewhat different to fighters. Bombers had the performance to actually be able to carry weight, and agility wasn't that important, and a few extra pounds of armor could be compensated for to a degree. Usually there was already also some rudimentary protection built into the designs, simply by virtue of being a bigger plane. Bullets had to pass through a larger space, they would be hitting multiple frames or multiple pieces of equipment, and thus they wouldn't cause that much damage to some of those critical areas. Sometimes you even already had an armored bulkhead or some very early fuel tank protection, but that was even rare in the late 1930s. As the war progressed, next to the crew, sometimes engines also got armor. The British Lancaster, Avro Lancaster, coming out in 1941, had very small armored plates to protect the engines, as did the earlier Handley Page Halifax, for example. But this was also more done due to the experience gained in the first years of World War II, rather than being there by design. Mind you, the B-17, for example, focused nearly entirely on protecting the crew rather than the engines. So the engine protection was something that the British did alongside crew protection. For fuel tank protection in the first years of World War II, this was still an entirely new thing. For example, there is a German Bf-110 that fell into British hands pretty early on. I believe it was in Norway. But this is something you can also read up in Richard Dunn's book, Exploding Fuel Tanks. Really good book as well. Definitely recommend it. The British found a protected fuel tank, a very early type of protected fuel tank in this aircraft. It wasn't as good as later models, but they were very interested in it, and they also shared it with the US. So everybody tried to work on this a little bit, but again, only when the fighting started did it really gain traction, and a lot of existing models around this time, especially if they were fighters, like the Supermarine Spitfire or the Messerschmitt Bf-109, had problems installing something like a protected fuel tank because the initial design didn't anticipate this. Also, a protected fuel tank, depending on the tank, decreases the amount of fuel a plane can actually carry because the volume gets decreased by the fuel tank, which doesn't change in size. It often cannot change in size because of the spatial limits inside an aircraft, and thus you have to take space away from the actual fuel reserve to install those protective layers. And not only does it increase weight then, it also decreases the fuel amount of the plane carries, and that results in less range, which is also one of the answers to why this Zero never got it. Anyway, to bring this to a close, I know I've been a little bit off a tangent, but this is very important context. Aircraft in the 1930s were of lighter construction, had less protection, and usually carried fewer guns. The 8 guns on the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfires are a complete outlier. The usual number of guns had only just increased from 2 light machine guns, which had been the standard since World War I, for the next, nearly 20 years, to something like 4 machine guns. This is only happening now with the Spanish Civil War and really just 1938, and most planes and a lot of And actually a lot of planes, even around this time, still operate around the premise of 2 or 4 light machine guns and sometimes 2 heavy machine guns, depending on the aircraft. In this context, 1 or 2 50 caliber machine guns provided a considerable increase in firepower. Yeah? The 50 cal, as we know today as sort of the armament of US fighters during World War II, had in fact been partially developed in anticipation that the light machine guns used in World War I won't cut it in a future war. This of course happened in the 1920s. America was slightly ahead of the curve in that respect, and it really anticipated stronger designs in the future, thus requiring a stronger gun to also take it down. Of course, completion's sake here, during World War I, heavy machine guns had already been used in aircraft, same caliber even, but less so than light machine guns. And not only that, but the 50 cal became relatively reliable, way more reliable than those early heavy machine guns used. And it was much better than the 30 cal. The 30 cal really didn't cut it. It was unreliable and it really wasn't suited for aerial warfare. So if you look at that World War I and interwar period, those 20 years, give or take, the 50 cal makes perfect sense. Yeah? The switch to the 50 cal from the 30 cal was very straightforward, which is why it happened relatively quickly and was more or less complete by the time the US is attacked at Pearl Harbor in 1941, even though the 30 cal is still in there somewhere. It's still in there, but it really is just waving goodbye. Okay, so that is that pre-World War II period ticked off. But then why did the US stick with 50 cals throughout the war, Second World War, in their aircraft when others didn't? And this is a very complex question once again, because a lot of context needs to be laid out. So I think that to answer this question, it is best to ask another question first. That question is, why did the British and Commonwealth forces not switch to the 50 cal in the same way as the US and started switching to the 20mm Hispano? They of course used the 50 cal on planes that came from the US and later on added it to some of their planes as well, like the Spitfire, as part of a mixed cannon and machine gun armament, but the 20mm became the primary fighter plane weapon. This, as far as I can tell, had multiple reasons. By the way, all my sources for this video, as always, they're in the description below, so if you want to have a look, just go there. There's also a lot of reading recommendations linked there, and as well as links to all my social media and so on, should you be inclined to follow me there. Okay, so let's go into this. We of course have that 8-gun battery on the Hurricane and the Spitfire that came out in the late 1930s. And this made the RAF think that they had a good piece and a solid piece of firepower kit under their belt. And they weren't necessarily wrong. 8 guns in the 1930s, even if they were light machine guns, that's a lot for an aircraft. Actually, yeah, it's at least double of most competitors, if not more. It's a lot of firepower. During the Battle of Britain, however, the RAF had to fight both fighters and bombers. And here the initial observation that the RAF has with their 303s, which was loosely based on the 30 cal machine gun, but it worked better and was an improved version, let's just say. Their initial observation was that these 8 guns on their fighters were doing just fine, even against bombers. However, as the battle progressed, the RAF noticed that more and more German planes started to feature armor, and that the initial accounts by pilots about the effect of their weapons was maybe a bit misleading. If you ever seriously investigated kill claims and actual losses, you'll notice that you will get 2 very different numbers. And yes, I know there were guidelines on how kills were claimed and scored and attributed and so on, but this was not a black and white affair. It really wasn't. Just go and take a look at the official records. In most archives you can find them relatively easily, and if you don't have access to an archive, most authors and books about the subject already have a lot of examples. But it's not that the pilots were not truthful as well. Of course, yes, we are all humans. Perhaps 1 or 2 claimed kills that never happened. There are reports that this actually did occur. But by and large, pilots will report what they see in good faith. As the RAF noticed that even with 8 light machine guns, they were not scoring as many kills as they thought, and more crucially, recognized that in most cases you only really get 1 chance to fire a solid burst into an enemy aircraft, so you need to make it count. And because German planes started getting more armor, they decided that a 20mm cannon would soon be necessary to defeat German Luftwaffe aircraft. But that is not to say that the Battle of Britain kickstarted this process in Britain. The Hispano had been in development for some time. This battle just results into a sort of catalyst, or things are being taken a little bit more serious. It really convinces the RAF that it needs to go with a cannon to essentially be future-proof. During this state of flux, they were unsure whether a 50 cal would be enough, plus being reliant on a new foreign gun. And also, as this armor starts being introduced, nobody really could tell whether a 50 cal is going to be effective against it at most combat ranges and in most environments. These protection measures get introduced into these aircraft very quickly, and they start getting very, very, very good at defeating light machine guns. And in fact, by the end of the war, most German aircraft, the armor that is used there is also effective against 50 cal at most combat ranges. But of course, in the thinking of the RAF here, but not just the RAF, also other countries, if you want to be protected against enemy fire, it is possible to do this against light and heavy machine guns. But if you want to be protected against cannon fire, you need to put so much armor into a plane that it will essentially fly like a wet dog. So a 20mm cannon was considered a future-proof concept. In Britain, the 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon had been in development for some time. In fact, it had been in development in other countries like France before that. I already spoke about this in a video once about the Spitfire, about its very early history with this gun, with the Hispano gun. And the RAF, of course, had a very difficult relationship with this 20mm weapon in the early days of the war. The gun would often jam, and because in field tests, this usually meant that after a few rounds, the fighter actually had to return to base. It really wasn't considered ready just yet. In fact, during the first time the Hispano was used in combat by the RAF, this was very early on, a Spitfire armed with one gun in each wing and no machine guns attacked a German bomber. And one of these Hispanos jammed after only one round fire, and the other one went through about half of the 60 total rounds. Yeah, this gun wasn't ready in 1939 or 1940, but it had potential. And that became ever clearer also because the RAF gained experience with cannons, not by using them, but by being shot at with cannons. And this is where we turn to the Germans. The German Bf 109 E3 and E4, the standard fighter during the Battle of Britain, had two 20mm MGFFs based on the 20mm Oerlikon. The E1 had four MG17s. The E1 did not have enough firepower, that's for sure. 4 light machine guns were really not cutting it anymore, at all. But some of these planes still saw service during the Battle of Britain. Also, as an aside, the Germans actually kept 2 MG17s as a backup on their fighters for way too long, but that's another story entirely. But with the Bf 109 E3, the 20mm MGFF gets introduced, and then later on we find the MGFF-M, which fires a Minengeschoss. This is essentially translated as a mine shell. It's an HE round crammed with about 18 grams of high explosive content. For context, it's a lot more than other 20mm HE rounds at the time. The early Soviet 20mm HE rounds had a filling of about 2 grams. Yeah? And this weapon proved that 20mm cannons, at least it proved it to the Germans, and I think it also proved it to the Brits as they were being shot at by this weapon. Talking about the Soviet shells here, by the way, and also then the French and so on, they drew the same conclusion as the Germans, although arguably maybe even a bit sooner. But that's, again, a whole other topic, and I don't want to complicate this even more. So apologies if I have to push out the Soviets, the French, the Italians, the Japanese weapons to the side here. The Germans didn't have a lot of guns on their planes. Yeah, the philosophy for the Germans and for some other countries as well was that the more guns you put on an aircraft, the more weight you put on an aircraft. And the more weight you put on an aircraft, the less performance you get unless you increase the engine performance. But a stronger engine usually also increases the weight by itself. So it's really, with engines, it's always a battle between the power the engine gives out compared to the weight of the engine. And then you place that into an aircraft, and suddenly you have to also take into account the additional weight of the aircraft and all its equipment. So it's quite a complex relationship. So what they realized is if they want to limit the amount of weight they have on the aircraft, they will have to rely on fewer guns. And if they do that, they better take guns with a lot of destructive power, hence a 20mm. The MGFF and the MGFF-M and the MG151-20 and the later MK108 had a lot of bang for their weight. This reduced relative weight and limited the complexity of the aircraft design and the requirement to make more space for these guns. So if you could get the same or more power behind a single gun as in, say, 4 light machine guns, and that single gun was still able to put out a lot of rounds in a very short term of time and have relatively good ballistic properties, then that single gun was considered superior to more lighter guns. Now the MGFF, it has to be said, it wasn't ideal. The muzzle velocity was low and it was limited to 60 rounds in drum mags, and this ammo limitation was something that a lot of early cannons struggled with, especially also the Hispano. But it was overcome when these cannons switched to belt-fed ammo or new guns were introduced, like the MG151-20, which was incidentally belt-fed. Nevertheless, a single hit out of any of these weapons usually meant that an aircraft, a fighter aircraft, was in trouble. And a couple of hits usually meant the end. The lighter the construction of the plane, usually the better it worked. Unless it's fabric, then it might just go straight through. Again, another story. The explosive effect, which could blow holes into an aircraft skin, damage the system, snaps cables, and seriously damage the construction, was very different to the machine gun, which relied on making a lot of hits in key areas like the fuel tanks, the engine, or the cockpit. So you have a trade-off. Either you score a few very strong hits but are limited in ammo capacity, although this actually doesn't become such much of an issue anymore later on as the belt-fed cannons get introduced. Or you need to score a lot of hits in the right areas to do damage. As far as the Germans are concerned, pilots usually only have a small split moment to make their shots count, and you really cannot afford to tangle with the enemy. So a 20mm cannon becomes the best option, also because the mine shell was a very good and destructive piece of kit. The new and better 20mm MG151-20 was also around the corner, so there was a future-proof system there, and because this weapon worked well against fighters and heavier planes like the bombers that you see around this early war time. For the RAF, the 303s, the light machine guns, they worked long enough, but they also anticipated that with increasing protection, especially in bombers, it won't be good enough anymore. And even against fighters, the opportunities to score a killing burst was low with such machine guns, other than with cannons. I think you can also see the thinking of the RAF in trying to optimize the 20mm Hispano to deal with protection like armor, because they went a completely different route than the Germans. The Germans initially used both armor-penetrating and HE rounds on their MGFF. When the mine shell appeared, the Minengeschoss, with the MGFF-M, the AP round, the 20mm AP round, never really fully disappears, but it is pushed aside. The mine shell, with that 18 grams of high explosive filler, operated either on a contact fuse or on a slight delay fuse. Really a tiny delay, which was meant to blow out portions of the enemy aircraft as the round sort of digs itself into the skin and destroy components with explosive force. This worked really rather well, and the Germans stuck with it until the end of the war, even using it, this mine shell with the MK108, the 30mm cannon. I will come back to this in just a second. Now the RAF instead focused on improving the armor protection of the Hispano by first going with an AP round good at destroying and blowing solid but small holes into fuel tanks or engines. This round had the advantage of going through a lot of material during its path, unlike the HE round, which generally exploded on impact. The disadvantage is that if you don't hit a key point, the Hispano AP round had so much force behind it that it would go in one side of the fuselage or wing and leave on the other side, leaving some damage of course, but nothing really major unless it hits a frame or a spar or something. This was certainly better than peppering an insignificant portion of a plane with MG bullets, but could be improved upon. But it is still reliant on hitting key parts like the engine, the controls, the cruise stations, the cooling, or the fuel tank. By the way, you most likely know this image. It's based on famous survivorship bias coming out of World War II. I made a whole video a long time ago where I explained this, and I'll link it below. But to make matters short here, the red dots signify where a bomber often got hit during World War II and returned to base. This is why these areas could be measured, because they are visible on those returning aircraft. Whereas the white areas indicate the areas where damage would often result in the loss of the plane, which are not measurable because the plane never got back. As you can see, the key areas are engines, fuel tanks, and the cockpit. Hit anywhere else, especially if the only thing you have is a machine gun, and you might as well not bother, because unless you are very, very lucky and shred a control cable or something, very low chances you're not going to do much. Also, generally it is impossible to protect all the vulnerable areas, especially with armor, which is very heavy, which is why it was reserved for pilots and crew. But you could at least strengthen or at least add some secondary protection to these vulnerable areas. To protect a protected or self-sealing fuel tank, for example, is still better than just a plain fuel tank, even if it gets penetrated. And you can add other measures like CO2-based fire extinguishers, for example, into engines. So I know that I'm still not talking about the US here, but just hear me out. The context here is quite important. I will be approaching the US in just a second. So the RAF had a cannon that had punch with a good AP round, but it still could be improved on. Incendiary compounds were also added. This is sometimes known as SAP or SAP, semi-armor piercing. This combined the penetration of the Hispano round, which was good, with a small explosive filler. This way, not only would it be more dangerous when hitting an engine, a fuel tank, but you would still do some damage when hitting a different area entirely, even if it's not a non-critical area. There's of course also the discussion, what was better, a British Hispano or a German MG151-20, but again, such a discussion is usually more about cherry picking. Both guns and crucially the ammunition worked differently, fulfilled a different purpose, and did that purpose very well. But they also operated on the same principle, being able to dispatch an enemy plane quickly with a few hits, rather than having to fire a full volley into him to increase the chances of hitting a key area, vulnerable area, often enough with a very small, less destructive round. Also, it's important to remember that in World War II, the average accuracy in aerial gunnery was low. Much lower than commonly thought. I know some people might point to special pilots renowned for their accuracy, but 1 or 2 pilots don't win a war. Even 300 aces don't win a war, as the Luftwaffe will tell you. You have to look at the full picture and average skill throughout the force. Some pilots got more gunnery training than others, thus increasing their skill. Some pilots were more talented, but on the whole, it was very difficult to hit a small plane like a fighter, and you also need to add to that the limited opportunities pilots had to actually fire their guns at an enemy in every fight. If you look at some of the data on how much ammo was fired and how many kills were claimed, and then look at those kill claims and then look at what can be confirmed with the real losses, this becomes pretty obvious. A lot of rounds were shot at a lot of targets apparently, but very few of those targets went down. I think one of the reasons why we have a skewed perspective on this might actually be World War II movies, where planes always have to explode after a couple of rounds, and World War II combat flight simulators, where we virtual pilots score hits, it must be said, relatively easily compared to real life, and kills come more easily as well, because pilots are more free to do what they want. Take the new IL-2 games, for example. It is not rare that many more kills are scored within a server mission that lasts like 2 hours than a real-life World War II battle for air superiority over a small area for a whole day, even though the amount of planes involved might not be all that different. The British and Germans went with 20mm for their own reason, which had some overlap. Back to the US. The 50 cal was more destructive than the light machine guns used at the time when it was introduced, in the 1920s, while possessing the same advantages in terms of ammo supply and the ability to place it in roughly the same spot. It was bigger and heavier, but worth the investment. Initially, planes had 1, then 2 50 cals, some mixed it up with 30 cals as well, of course. It's only in the late 1930s and early 1940s that 4, then 6 and sometimes 8 with the P-47 were installed into the aircraft. For the US, during World War II, this weapon was a sweet spot. Not because it is an actual sweet spot, but because it worked for the US. It would also have worked for the British, most likely, but it would not have worked for the Germans and the Japanese. Why? We can answer this by looking at the German Mk108, a 30mm cannon. This weapon was introduced into German fighters with the Bf 109G6, together with two MG131s, 30mm heavy machine guns, somewhat comparable to the 50 cal, substituting the lighter MG17s. It also saw service then in other planes, right? Why was this weapon introduced? Well, that is because the 20mm, although a good gun against fighters, was starting to struggle against larger machines like British or American heavy bombers. It could still shoot them down, but needed more hits to do so. The answer to this was found in the Mk108. This also fired a mine shell packed with a lot more of explosive filler and was able to do some good damage against B-17s or B-24s. It wasn't the easiest gun to use, but it did its job rather well. There is a discussion, of course, that can be had if the Germans had to go the route of the Hispano, which had better ballistic properties than the MG151-20 and the Mk108. You know, the shell arc of the Mk108 was essentially firing a mortar. That's an exaggeration, of course, but it's not far off. Then maybe this would not have been necessary. Maybe they could have stuck with something like the Hispano with its armor penetration capability, but I'm not too sure about that. In any case, the Mk108 was a light gun for its capabilities, a very light gun for its capabilities, in fact, and it provided a lot of power and was able to take on heavy bombers that the Luftwaffe had to face. Again, often you see pictures of returning aircraft littered with holes which look impressive and are impressive. Especially the B-17 was able to take a lot more punishment than many other planes at the time. But of every plane you see, there is also the other one that didn't make it. Now, consider the targets the US had to face, and you will see that the US Army Air Force and the US Navy had very different targets to the Luftwaffe. They did not face heavy bombers. Usually it was a fighter or a medium bomber from the Luftwaffe or the Japanese Navy or the Japanese Army Air Service. As such, the need for a weapon that was able to take on a large, strong and well-protected aircraft wasn't there. If it had been, I'm sure the US would have thought more about cannons and would have used the Hispano more often and quicker once it started working properly. But it didn't need to. The 50 cal was good enough in the targets that the US faced. But this also rested on the fact that the US placed 6 or 8 guns on a fighter with a good ammo load and good ammunition. Had there been less machine guns on these planes, they would not have been as successful. 4 50 cals on the other hand, and we have some evidence of this during the war, were still somewhat limited and considered not enough. 6 or 8 was good or better, respectively. This is where we can compare a few of the guns in a more data-like approach. We have the 30 cal, the 303, the 50 cal, the MG131, the MG151-20 and the Mk108. I've taken the data here from Anthony Williams and Dr. Emmanuel Gustin. They have a lot of it and do a good job at explaining the issue in their book as well. We start by weight. You can see that the 50 cal is a heavy weapon. It weighs more than twice the 30 cal. It is considerably heavier than the similar MG131. And compared with cannons, it is, actually it's more half the weight than the MG151-20 and about half of the Mk108. Just imagine that, a 30mm cannon being about double the weight of a 50 cal. That just explains to you how light the Mk108 actually was, and at the same time how heavy the 50 cal was. As for rate of fire, it is midfield. Muzzle velocity is good, which makes the gun a bit easier to use. Projectile weight, well, the 50 cal scores well for a machine gun, but you really can't compare it here to cannons or light machine guns because of the weight scaling. It's best to compare it here with a similar caliber like the MG131. The power to weight ratio, how much power does the gun put out compared to how much it weighs, also leaves it in midfield. Looking at this, the 50 cal does not look impressive. It looks like a gun that does not have a standout feature, save perhaps its muzzle velocity. It's heavy and it's slow compared to the direct competitors, but here is where that data can be misleading if we don't place it into the context. Which is why I didn't want to add this sort of chart at the beginning and why I don't like comparisons based only on this sort of data. it invites cherry picking. Sure enough, one-on-one, the 50 cal is not the most efficient gun for its size and weight, even though a comparison like here across multiple calibers is useless without that context that I talked about. But here we are ignoring the influence of the ammunition fired, which is rather important. And the 50 cal bullets, 12.7 by 99, fired by US aircraft during World War II, they were good. They had good penetration potential, good ballistics, and there were many iterations, from pure black tip AP or with an incendiary compound. And there was plenty of force behind these rounds. Not as much as, not as much as a 20mm AP round from an Hispano, but again, that's useless in a one-on-one comparison between two very different weapons. As well as that, the 50 cal had some logistical advantages. Nearly all US aircraft used the same ammunition. This made production straightforward. That is not to say that the 50 cal didn't have some limits as well. Generally at point blank range, it could easily penetrate the armor that you see on fighters around this time, but at combat ranges this is less likely, especially as the rounds actually have to tumble through the aircraft before they hit the armor plate. Most German pilots could rely on the armor behind them protecting them from 50 cal fire in most scenarios. A 20mm AP shell, on the other hand, would go through that piece of armor more often than not. The 50 cal rate of fire was also a bit low compared to other guns of its caliber, and rate of fire helps you to concentrate a lot of rounds on a small area rather than sort of spacing them out, right? Of course, if you have 6 or 8 guns, you'll still hit with a good number of your bullets, even if your rate of fire isn't that ideal. Also, US planes didn't fire one of these guns to every 20mm cannon fired on a German plane, but they fired 2, 3, or 4 50 cals per German cannon, depending on the planes we compare. This is just a comparison about who has more guns or better guns, like playing top trumps and winning because your plane has more guns than the other plane. Even if all you have are 20 Nerf guns strapped to a glider and your opponent has a light machine gun on a Cessna, I mean, sure, you can put your bets on that, but what sort of comparison is this? We need to look at the actual use of these weapons for the average pilot, and based on the context of World War II, this means that both sides essentially made the right choice, give or take a few apples. And one gun is never going to be ideal in all scenarios, but overall, they made the right choices. Perhaps never the ideal choices, like I said, but it worked for them. Also, some pilots might say they think the 50 cal was better. Others would prefer the 20mm. That's possible, but that only means that it was the weapon this pilot preferred. And on the whole, there were actually very few pilots that had a chance to compare US 50 cal and German 20mm, and certainly not when they were able to do so. They were certainly not able to do so in combat. Commonwealth pilots might be able to weigh in a bit, comparing 50 cals to Hispanos, but they also use these weapons differently to US pilots. So again, context is both king and queen. Let's take another contextual example. The 50 cal was also a weapon that got a solid reputation for ground strafing. On the Western Front, US fighter bombers used their 50 cals against German soft targets like trucks very effectively. They were very effective in taking those targets out. And this made things really difficult for the Germans in France in 1944. In this scenario, they were good in taking out soft targets like trucks. They were not good at taking out tanks. A 50 cal bullet will not knock out a tank, a Tiger tank, by magically bouncing off the ground under the tank. I know there's at least one documentary that makes it sound like this, but if you just think about how bullets interact, especially with the ground and with armored targets, you'll notice that this is not possible. Sure enough, German Focke-Wulf 119s also used their multiple 20mm cannons for strafing, especially on the Eastern Front against trucks, and they were successful. Just like British planes using 20mm on the Western Front in 1944, along with the Americans, were also successful in taking out soft targets. This shows that all three weapons, although very differently, can work equally well if employed right, and the best way to judge the relative weapon is to look at how it was used, why it was used like this, and whether it was able to do its job, rather than comparing apples with oranges. So to sum this up, I think I've gone on for some time, but to sum this up, Germans went with a cannon because they wanted to have as much potential behind a small number of guns, which reduced weight. And yes, this is also roughly the case if we include the ammo. A MGFF weighed about as much as a single 50 cal, and one MG151-20 weighed less than 250 cals, while arguably delivering more destructive force, and because the Germans considered that in the average dogfight, a few good hits with a cannon are more likely, provided it has a good rate of fire, than a lot of hits with a machine gun, while also delivering more power per hit. Now for them, cannons were a way to go, and they weren't wrong. As the war went on, they increased the amount of cannons and the caliber because of the targets they started to face, which were mainly heavy bombers. That really was their primary target at this point, at least on the Western Front, and on the whole, it worked. Of course, a P-47, a fighter aircraft, could also soak up a few 20mm shells, and perhaps a cannon like the Hispano would have been better here as well. But that's a case-by-case comparison. But even then, if the P-47 got hit by a few 20mm and didn't get shot down, usually it had to fly home and took no longer part in the fight. Yeah, something a smaller caliber gun on a German aircraft might not have achieved. So there is actually a very good account of this in the book Thunderbolt by Robert Johnson, who was a US fighter ace. In one of his missions, he gets hit by a German plane with cannons. His P-47 can still fly. It is struggling a bit, but it can still fly, and he starts heading home. He is at this point essentially a mission kill for the Germans. He's not shot down, but he's out of the fight. On his way back, a FW-190 spots him and starts shooting at him again. But this German has no more cannon ammo. He already expended everything on a bomber, well, we don't know. And he's only firing his machine guns. And from the sound of it, it was light machine guns, so like the 7.92s of the MG17s. And he fires all that he has, these two machine guns, with all the ammo that he still has, into Johnson's Thunderbolt, which keeps on flying and makes it back. There is no doubt that if instead of having two MG17s, if the Focke-Wulf 190 only had a single 20mm cannon left, well, he would have at least had two, because that's how it was built, but let's say one jammed. But if he had only a one 20mm cannon left with some ammo, Johnson would most likely not have made it back. And this story just shows how ineffective a light machine gun round, which had been the standard since 1916 to like the mid to late 1930s, had become. And every nation had found their own way in dealing with this problem. By the way, I don't think if you, for example, take a Focke-Wulf 190A8, a late version of the Focke-Wulf Anton series, with two heavy machine guns and four 20mm cannons as standards, there is no argument that you can make that it is not applying a more destructive force on a target in a single burst than a 6-gun P-51 or even an 8-gun P-47. But that amount of destructive force a Focke-Wulf 190 had to pump out, due to having to shoot down heavy bombers, was far higher than what a P-51 or P-47, whom really only faced Focke-Wulf 190s, or at most medium bombers, had to have. Germany managed to compensate for the bomber threat, which really is a specialized task, by using a number of cannons of higher caliber to increase the chances of a one pass, one kill on heavy bombers. Hence, for example, why the Me-262 came out with four 30mm Mk108s, although it had very early on been planned to have something like in the realm of two 20mm cannons. There's a couple of proposals, but two 20mm cannons had been anticipated at one stage, as it was meant to be mainly a fighter-on-fighter platform and not going against bombers. And I'm not talking about the bombing thing with this aircraft. That's again another topic. You could say that in the Me-262, the Germans paired their philosophy of using a gun that has a high destructive potential with the US way of thinking of using more guns. The results were four 30mm, which really propelled the Me-262 into a league of its own. It is an outlier. Usually planes couldn't get this sort of firepower without the use of gun pods, which is really suboptimal because it hits the performance. The US, on the other hand, decided that the best way to go was to place a lot of heavy machine guns into the aircraft, which had good overall performance, and any deficiencies could be compensated for by more guns and more bullets. The US was never put into a position where a new target, like a heavy bomber, appeared that required a change in weaponry. As such, for World War II, the 50 cal was a good weapon for US aircraft. It was an excellent weapon for US aircraft, based on their operational and tactical needs. You might judge it as good enough or just right, depending on how you look at it. It was a solid piece of kit to standardize around for the time. But just like for the US, 20mm cannons and 30mm cannons was a solid piece of kit to standardize around for the Germans. However, even going back to the US now, even by the end of World War II, the US was investigating the possibility of switching to those cannons. Yeah? Part of this was because also combat experience showed that the chances of hits are low in an ever faster paced aerial combat scenario. You really should make sure that the hits you get with your guns can apply the most destructive effect possible per hit, and that really should be more than with a 50 cal. Commonly, the Korean War is here taken as the reason why the US made the switch. In actual fact, it actually started way earlier. Really, it's a process that kickstarted with World War II, but the development of homegrown cannons, which actually started during the war, took some time. The US really wasn't prepared to change horse in World War II, which makes sense. It took perhaps a bit long for the switch to finally happen. Korea probably accelerated the process. But to say that Korea was the reason the US started to develop an aircraft cannon is wrong. But anyway, that's yet another topic, and I've gone on for long enough, so let me know what you think about this topic, and I do hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon or channel memberships. Support us there, also get some extra sneak peeks, and can watch new videos before anyone else. As always, I hope all of you guys have a great day, and see you in the sky.